Welcome, dear listeners. There is something deeply unsettling about a clock that does not behave as it should. We trust clocks, don't we? We build our entire lives around them, our meals, our meetings, our midnights. So when a clock strikes 13 instead of 12, it does not merely mark the wrong hour, it marks the beginning of something far more sinister. Tonight, we step inside Thornfield Manor, a grand old house sitting quietly in the English countryside, wrapped in fog and secrets. The year is 1952. The guests have gathered for what should have been a perfectly pleasant weekend. Good food, fine wine, polite conversation. But at the stroke of midnight, something goes terribly wrong. The grandfather clock in the drawing room strikes once, twice, and keeps going, 13 times in all. And before the last chime fades into the cold night air, a gunshot rings out. By the time the guests rush in, the room is empty, and a priceless family heirloom gone. Was it theft? Was it something darker? And what on earth does a clock striking 13 have to do with any of it? Fortunately, among the guests that weekend is one Miss Jane Marple, a quiet, sharp-eyed elderly lady from the village of St. Mary Mead. She knits, she observes, and she notices things that everyone else is far too busy to see. This is the clock that struck 13. Shall we begin? The guests of Thornfield Manor. The motorcar turned off the main road just past 4 in the afternoon, and Miss Jane Marple got her first proper look at Thornfield Manor through the smudged window of Colonel Bantry's old rover. It was, she thought, exactly the sort of house where things happened. Not that she said so aloud, of course. One did not say such things aloud. But she noticed the way the iron gates leaned slightly inward, as though they had been pushed open one too many times in a hurry. She noticed the upper window on the east wing, third from the left, where a curtain moved, though there was no visible breeze. And she noticed that the gravel on the long driveway had been freshly raked, which struck her as slightly unusual for a November weekend. Small things, possibly meaningless things. But Miss Marple had lived long enough to know that meaningless things had a rather poor habit of turning out to be quite meaningful indeed. "Splendid place, isn't it?" said Colonel Bantry from the driver's seat, leaning forward over the steering wheel with the enthusiasm of a man who had been looking forward to this weekend for quite some time. "Gerald Ashworth's family has owned it since 1887. Told me so himself at the club last month." "Lovely," said Miss Marple, still watching the east window. The curtain had stopped moving. Thornfield Manor belonged to Mr. Gerald Ashworth, a tall, broad-shouldered man of 53 who met them at the front steps with a firm handshake and a smile that almost reached his eyes. He wore a brown tweed jacket and spoke in the clipped, the confident manner of someone who was accustomed to being the most important person in any given room. His wife, Mrs. Dorothea Ashworth, stood slightly behind him. She was a slender woman, pale in the way that suggested either delicate health or considerable worry, and she wore a string of pearls that she touched, very briefly, when she thought no one was looking. Miss Marple noticed. "So glad you could make it, Miss Marple," Gerald said, though his tone suggested he had not given her attendance much thought either way. "Dolly insisted we invite the whole crowd this year. Something about the house needing life in it," he chuckled. "I told her the house has plenty of life. It's the heating that's questionable." Dorothea smiled thinly. "Don't mind Gerald. He's in a wonderful mood, really." Inside, the manor was warm and smelled of wood smoke and old furniture polish. A young maid took Miss Marple's coat and bag with practiced efficiency, and Miss Marple thanked her by name, or tried to, before realizing she did not yet know the girl's name, which she remedied immediately by asking. "Elsie, ma'am," the girl said, with a small curtsy. "Elsie Pratt." "What a sensible name," said Miss Marple, and meant it entirely. The other guests arrived within the hour. First came Mr. Philip Holt, a solicitor from London, thin and precise, with the kind of face that gave nothing away and the kind of eyes that took everything in. He arrived alone, which Miss Marple noted, and he greeted Gerald Ashworth with a handshake that lasted a fraction longer than was strictly necessary, accompanied by a look that passed between the two men like a telegram no one else was meant to read. Then came Mrs. Vivienne Castle, a widow of 50, handsome in a theatrical sort of way, with dark red hair that was almost certainly not entirely natural, and a laugh that filled whatever room she entered. She kissed Dorothea on both cheeks and called Gerald darling in a manner that made Dorothea's smile go very slightly rigid. Last to arrive was young Thomas Ashworth, Gerald and Dorothea's son, 26 years old, who roared up the driveway in a small green sports car 20 minutes after everyone else and bounded through the front door with his collar turned up and his hair uncombed, looking rather like a man who had not slept particularly well and was not altogether sorry about it. Sorry, he said to the room at large. I'm not sounding especially sorry. Train was delayed, then the car. He spotted Miss Marple near the fireplace and paused. Oh, hello, don't think we've met. Miss Marple, she said pleasantly. I'm a friend of the Bantrys. Right, yes. He nodded, distracted already, his eyes moving to the doorway through which his father had just disappeared. Something shifted in his expression, something brief and difficult to name, not quite resentment, not quite fear, somewhere between the two. Miss Marple filed it away carefully and returned to her knitting. By the time they all gathered in the drawing room before dinner, the fire was burning well and the lamps had been lit against the early dark of November. The room was comfortable and handsome, good rugs, good paintings, well-kept furniture. And in the far corner, just standing tall and slightly apart from everything else, was the grandfather clock. It was an impressive piece. Dark mahogany, brass fittings, a painted face with Roman numerals. It had, Gerald mentioned with some pride as he handed round the sherry, been in the family since 1901, a Whitmore and Sons original, worth a considerable sum, apparently, though Gerald said this in the modest tone of a man who very much wanted you to know it. Miss Marple looked at the clock with mild interest and then looked away. She would think about it again later, much later, when it would matter rather more. The dinner table. Secret's dinner at Thornfield Manor was served at 7:30, which Miss Marple privately considered rather late for a November evening when the cold had a way of making itself felt in one's bones, regardless of how good the fire was. But she said nothing of the sort, naturally. She simply wore her thicker cardigan and took her seat at the long dining table with the quiet contentment of a woman who had learned, over many decades, to be comfortable in most situations. The dining room was impressive in the slightly oppressive way that old English dining rooms sometimes were. Dark oak panelling, heavy curtains drawn against the night, silver candlesticks throwing warm, unsteady light across the faces of the assembled guests. A large portrait of some previous Ashworth, stern, mustachioed. I, deeply unimpressed with the present century, looked down from above the fireplace with an air of permanent disapproval. Gerald sat at the head of the table, as was his habit and his right. Dorothea sat at the opposite end, straight-backed and composed, though she had touched her pearl necklace twice already since they had sat down, and dinner had not yet properly begun. Philip Holt sat to Gerald's left, his napkin arranged with geometrical precision across his lap. Vivienne Castle had somehow arranged herself directly to Gerald's right, which Miss Marple noted had not escaped Dorothea's attention. Thomas sat midway down the table next to Colonel Bantry and spent the first course largely in conversation with his bread roll. Miss Marple sat between Mrs. Bantry and Philip Holt, which suited her very well indeed. Mrs. Bantry was excellent company, and Philip Holt, she suspected, was the sort of man who revealed more in silence than most people did in conversation. The soup was a good, clear consommé, and it was during the soup that the first interesting thing happened. It was not dramatic. It was, in fact, so quiet that Miss Marple was fairly certain no one else at the table noticed it at all. Gerald Ashworth, in the middle of a perfectly ordinary sentence about the renovations he intended to make to the East Wing in spring, stopped, just for a moment. His eyes had gone to Philip Holt, and Philip Holt had made the smallest possible movement with his left hand. Not quite a gesture, not quite a signal, but something in between. And Gerald had resumed his sentence as though nothing had occurred. Miss Marple ate her consommé and thought about village life. Specifically, she thought about the time Mr. Hodgson, the butcher, and his supplier, Mr. Crane, had carried on an almost identical silent conversation across the counter at the St. Mary Mead summer fete, 3 days before it emerged that Mr. Crane had been quietly overcharging Mr. Hodgson for 18 months, and they had finally come to some sort of arrangement about it. People, she reflected, were really very consistent. It was Vivian Castle who first mentioned the heirloom, which Miss Marple thought was either very natural or very deliberate, and she was not yet certain which. "Gerald," Vivian said during the fish course, in the warm, confiding tone of someone sharing a secret with an entire dinner table, "you simply must show everyone the Thornfield pendant this weekend. I told the Hendersons about it last month, and they absolutely refused to believe me." Gerald smiled, a real smile this time, broader and less controlled than the ones he had been distributing since their arrival. "Ah," he said. "Yes, I suppose we might." "The Thornfield pendant," Colonel Bantry said, with the alert expression of a man whose interest had been genuinely caught. "A family piece," Gerald said, settling back slightly in his chair with the ease of a man approaching a favourite subject. 17th century, ruby and gold. Central stone is nearly 14 carats apparently, though I've never had it independently verified. Been in the family since my great-great-grandmother's time. Worth..." He paused with studied modesty. "Well, considerably more than it was 20 years ago. Or let's say that." "It's absolutely extraordinary," Vivian said, with enthusiasm that may or may not have been entirely genuine. "The setting alone." "Where do you keep it?" Thomas said. The question was asked lightly enough, casually, in the tone of mild curiosity, but something in it landed differently. Perhaps it was the timing. Perhaps it was the fact that Thomas had been so quiet until that moment. Gerald looked at his son for just a moment too long before answering. "Securely," he said, with a small smile. "Quite securely." Thomas nodded and looked back at his plate. Dorothea touched her pearls. Miss Marple reached for her water glass and said nothing at all. After the main course, a very creditable roast lamb, she thought, the kitchen clearly knew what it was doing. The conversation moved through several topics with the slightly effortful ease of people who knew each other well enough to be comfortable, but not quite well enough to be entirely honest. Philip Holt spoke about a case he had recently handled, vague on the details, precise on the outcome, in the manner of a solicitor who enjoyed demonstrating competence without risking indiscretion. Vivienne told a long and entertaining story about a holiday in the south of France that seemed to involve a missing passport, a sympathetic gendarme, and rather more wine than was strictly advisable. Colonel Bantry talked about his roses, which were, he felt, finally beginning to respond to the new fertilizer he had been trying. Miss Marple listened to all of it with genuine interest and said the right things at the right moments, because she had been doing exactly that for 60-odd years and was very good at it. But underneath the pleasant surface of the conversation, she was doing something else entirely. She was watching. She watched the way Philip Holt's eyes tracked Gerald Ashworth's movements around the room, whenever Gerald rose to refill glasses or speak to the butler. She watched the way Thomas Ashworth's jaw tightened slightly every time his father laughed too loudly at one of Vivian's jokes. She watched Dorothea Ashworth, who smiled and spoke and performed the role of gracious hostess with considerable skill, but whose hands, Miss Marple noticed, were never quite still, and she watched the doorway, because twice during dinner, she had seen the young maid Elsie pause just outside it, in the corridor. for slightly longer than the business of clearing and carrying required. It was after dessert, when the ladies had withdrawn to the sitting room and left the gentlemen to their port, that Dorothea Ashworth sat down beside Miss Marple with the deliberate casualness of someone who has been waiting for an opportunity. "I hope you're comfortable, Miss Marple," she said. "The blue room can be a little draughty. I've asked Mrs. Henley, that's our housekeeper, to put an extra blanket out." "Most thoughtful," Miss Marple said warmly. "It's a beautiful room, that watercolour above the dresser. Is it local?" Dorothea glanced at her with slight surprise, as though she had expected a different kind of conversation. "Yes, actually. The church at Welling Cross. Gerald's mother painted it." A pause. "She was rather talented." "She must have been." Another pause, longer this time. Vivian was across the room, examining the bookshelves with the focused attention of someone who was not really looking at the books. Mrs. Bantry was describing, to no one in particular, the merits of a particular type of window box. "Miss Marple," Dorothea said quietly, "Arthur Bantry tells me you are rather observant about people." "Oh, I don't know about that," Miss Marple said, with complete sincerity. "I'm a very ordinary person, really. I simply find people interesting." Dorothea looked at her for a moment. Her eyes were grey and tired, and considerably sharper than the rest of her face suggested. "Yes," she said at last. "Well, so do I." She rose smoothly as the gentleman rejoined them, and did not say another word about it for the remainder of the evening. But Miss Marple sat with her knitting and turned the small exchange over in her mind like a stone she had found on a path. The kind that looked ordinary until you picked it up and found the underside damp and unexpectedly interesting. Something was wrong in Thornfield Manor. She could not have said precisely what. She could not have pointed to a single definitive thing and named it. But something was wrong. She was quite sure of it. The grandfather clock in the drawing room struck 10, then 11. The guests retired, one by one, until the house was quiet. Miss Marple lay in the blue room under 2 blankets. She was grateful for the second one, as it happened, and listened to the silence of the old house settling around her, and waited, without quite knowing she was waiting, for midnight. The 13th Chime. Miss Marple was not, as a rule, a poor sleeper. She had spent enough years in the company of her own thoughts to have made a reasonable peace with them, and she generally found that when she put her head on the pillow with a clear conscience and a warm enough bedroom, sleep followed without much argument. But that night, she could not settle. She lay in the blue room with the extra blanket pulled up to her chin and stared at the ceiling and tried to identify, as she sometimes did with difficult things, exactly what it was that was bothering her. It was not the bed, which was perfectly comfortable. It was not the cold, which the second blanket had adequately addressed. It was not even the rather persistent dripping of what she suspected was a loose gutter somewhere on the north side of the house. It was the house itself. Old houses had personalities, Miss Marple had always believed. Not in any supernatural sense, she was far too practical for that, but in the accumulated sense of the people who had lived in them and the habits those people had left behind in the walls and the floorboards and the particular way the doors hung on their hinges. Thornfield Manor had the personality of a house that was holding something back, not hiding it exactly, just waiting for the right moment. She turned onto her side. The clock on her bedside table said 11:42. She closed her eyes firmly and told herself to stop being fanciful. She was not asleep, but she was somewhere close to it, that soft, blurred country on the border of waking. When she heard the first sound, it was not the clock. Not yet. It was something else. A footstep, for she thought, in the corridor outside her room. Light and deliberate, the step of someone who knew exactly where they were going and was taking care to be quiet about it. She lay still and listened. Another step, then another, then silence. Miss Marple opened her eyes. She considered getting up. she considered it seriously, in the practical way she considered most things, weighing the cold floor against the potential interest of whatever was moving through the corridor at 11:50 at night. In the end, she decided against it, for no better reason than that her slippers were on the far side of the room and she was very warm where she was. She would, she thought, simply listen, a decision she would later feel mildly foolish about. But that came later. The grandfather clock in the drawing room below began to strike midnight at precisely 12 o'clock, which was, at least, one thing in Thornfield Manor that was behaving exactly as it should. 1. The sound was deep and resonant, the kind of sound that old clocks make when they have been keeping time long enough to have developed a certain authority about it. It moved through the floorboards and up through the walls of the blue room, with the comfortable inevitability of something that had been doing this for 50 years and intended to go on doing it. 2. 3. Miss Marple found herself counting automatically, as one does. 4. 5. 6. She was thinking about Dorothea Ashworth's grey, tired eyes and the things she had almost said, and then not said, and about the way Philip Holt's hands had been very still on the dinner table, in the particular manner of someone who was making them be still on purpose. 7, 8, 9. And about Thomas Ashworth's face when his father had said securely, and about young Elsie Pratt pausing in the corridor outside the dining room for slightly longer than 10, 11, 12. She waited for the silence. It did not come. 13. Miss Marple sat up in bed. For a moment, she simply sat there, quite still, with the blanket pooled around her waist and the darkness of the blue room pressing in from all sides, and thought, I miscounted. It was the most obvious explanation, and she was a great believer in obvious explanations. She had been distracted, thinking about Dorothea and Philip Holt and Elsie Pratt, and she had simply miscounted. Clocks did not strike 13. It was not a thing that happened. She counted back carefully in her mind. She had not miscounted. She was still sitting there, working through this, when the gunshot came. It was not a loud sound, precisely. Gunshots in real life were rarely as dramatic as the ones in the pictures. She had learned this many years ago, and it had never stopped surprising her how small a sound could carry so much consequence. This one was sharp and flat and very definite, like a large book dropped hard on a stone floor, and it came from below, from the direction of the drawing room, she thought, or somewhere close to it. Then silence. Complete and total silence, of the kind that follows a sound that everyone in a house has heard, and no one yet knows what to do about. Miss Marple was out of bed before she had consciously decided to get up. She found her slippers with more efficiency than she would have expected of herself, pulled her dressing gown on over her nightclothes, and was at her bedroom door in what she privately considered rather good time for a woman of her age. The corridor was dark. She could hear, from further down the hall, the sounds of other doors opening, a murmur of voices, the creak of floorboards under uncertain feet. Someone had a torch. Its beam appeared at the far end of the corridor like a pale and slightly panicked lighthouse. What on earth? That was Colonel Bantry's voice, thick with interrupted sleep. I heard it too, said Philip Holt, and his voice was alert in a way that suggested he had not been asleep at all. Miss Marple said nothing and moved toward the staircase. The drawing-room door was standing open. This was the first thing she noticed, before she had even reached the bottom of the stairs. The door that she was fairly certain had been closed when they had all retired for the evening was now standing wide open, and the lamp on the side table was on, throwing a rectangle of yellow light out into the entrance hall. The second thing she noticed was that the room appeared to be empty. She went in. The drawing room looked at first glance exactly as it had looked when they had left it some 2 hours before. The fire had burned down to deep red embers. The sherry glasses had been cleared away. The furniture sat in its proper arrangement, with the permanent composure of furniture that expected to be looked at and had nothing to hide. The grandfather clock stood in the corner and showed 4 minutes past 12, its pendulum swinging with undisturbed serenity, as though it had not 12 minutes ago done something that grandfather clocks were categorically not supposed to do. Miss Marple stood in the middle of the room and turned slowly. There was no one here. No body, no obvious sign of struggle, no weapon, but there, on the writing desk in the far corner, where Gerald Ashworth had made a small ceremony of showing them the Thornfield pendant before dinner, setting it out on a fold of blue velvet with the quiet pride of a man displaying something irreplaceable. The velvet was there. The pendant was not. The others arrived within 2 minutes, in various states of undress and alarm. Gerald Ashworth came last, which Miss Marple noted, and he was fully dressed, or which she noted rather more. "The pendant," Dorothea said from the doorway, in a voice stripped entirely of its dinner-party composure. "Gerald, the pendant." "I can see that," Gerald said, in a tone that was controlled in the way that things are controlled when considerable effort is being applied to the controlling. "I heard a gunshot," Colonel Bantry said firmly. He was the sort of man who felt better when he could state a fact with conviction. "Quite clearly, a gunshot." "We all heard it," said Philip Holt. He was standing just inside the doorway, and he was looking at the room, not at the empty velvet, not at the clock, not at any of the things the others were looking at. He was looking at the window. Miss Marple looked at the window too. It was closed, latched, in fact. She could see the brass latch from where she stood, off firmly in the downward position. The heavy curtains were drawn across it, just as they had been all evening, but there was something on the floor, small. Easy to miss if you were not specifically looking at the floor near the window. A very small piece of glass, just one. A single curved fragment, no larger than a thumbnail, catching the lamplight from the side table. Miss Marple did not move toward it. She did not draw anyone's attention to it. She simply noted its exact position, approximately 18 inches from the left edge of the curtain, 3 inches from the baseboard, and filed it away with the care of someone storing something they intended to retrieve later. "We ought to telephone the police," Mrs. Bantry said, with the practical decisiveness that Miss Marple had always admired in her. "Yes," said Gerald Ashworth. "Yes. Oh, of course." But he did not move immediately. His eyes were on the empty blue velvet, and his expression was not quite grief, not quite anger, something more complicated than either. Thomas Ashworth stood at the back of the group, near the door. His hair was uncombed, the same as it had been when he arrived, Miss Marple recalled, and his face in the lamplight was very carefully blank, too carefully, perhaps. The grandfather clock ticked on, serenely indifferent, keeping its own counsel. Miss Marple stood in the warm, ruined quiet of the drawing room and thought about clocks, about the way sound carried through old houses, about a single curved fragment of glass on a clean floor, about a pendant that had been in a family since the 17th century and was now, apparently, nowhere at all. And underneath all of it, so patient and persistent as the ticking of the clock itself, one question that she could not yet answer. Why 13? The extra chime had not been an accident. She was sure of that much. A clock did not simply acquire an extra stroke on its own. Not a Whitmore and Sons original. Not a mechanism that had been running reliably for 50 years. Something had been done to it. Someone had interfered with it deliberately, which meant the 13th chime had been intended. The question was whether it had been intended as a signal, and if so, for whom. She did not have the answer yet, but she would. She generally did in the end, though it sometimes took rather longer than she would have liked, and occasionally required her to be wrong about something first, which she found moderately irritating even after all these years. She pulled her dressing gown a little tighter against the chill and waited for the police to come. The morning investigation. The police arrived at 1:30 in the morning in the form of Detective Inspector Graves, a solidly built man of 40-something with a methodical manner and the slightly resigned expression of someone who had been called out of a warm bed on a cold November night and was making the best of it. He was accompanied by a younger constable named Perkins, who wrote everything down with the focused concentration of a man who had recently been told that good notes were the foundation of good police work and had taken this very much to heart. Inspector Graves interviewed everyone briefly that night and more thoroughly the following morning, which Miss Marple thought was sensible. People told you different things at 1:30 in the morning than they did at 10 o'clock over breakfast, and both sets of things were usually interesting for different reasons. She herself was interviewed at 10:15 in the small sitting room off the entrance hall, while the smell of toast and coffee drifted through from the dining room, and the November sun made a pale and unconvincing effort at the window. "You're a guest of the Bantrys, I understand," Inspector Graves said, consulting his notes. "That's right. We've known the Ashworths for some years, through Gerald's membership at the same club as Arthur, I believe. And you heard the clock strike and then the gunshot?" "Yes, the clock struck 13 times. I counted quite carefully. And then, perhaps 15 to 20 seconds later, the shot." Inspector Graves looked up from his notes. He had the expression of a man exercising patience. "Clocks don't strike 13. Oh, Miss Marple." "No," she agreed pleasantly. "They generally don't." He looked at her for a moment, then wrote something down. Miss Marple did not attempt to see what it was. After her interview, she went directly to the drawing room. She had been hoping to do this since 6 o'clock that morning, when she had lain in the blue room watching the pale light grow at the curtain edges and making a mental list of the things she needed to look at properly, in daylight, without a crowd of alarmed people standing between her and the evidence. Inspector Graves had sealed the room the previous night and unsealed it again this morning after his own examination, and the Constable Perkins was stationed near the door with his notebook, which was slightly inconvenient but not insurmountable. "I wonder," Miss Marple said to Perkins, or with her best vague elderly manner, "whether I might just sit in here for a little while. The sitting room is rather draughty and my knitting." She held up the knitting bag she had thought to bring for exactly this purpose. "I find I concentrate better when my hands are occupied." Perkins looked uncertain. Then he looked at the knitting. Knitting, his expression suggested, was not something he had been trained to consider a threat to an active investigation. "I suppose that's all right," he said. "Thank you so much," said Miss Marple, and settled herself in the armchair nearest the window with the serene efficiency of someone who had been getting into rooms they weren't supposed to be in for 40 years. She knitted and she looked. The piece of glass was gone. Graves's team had collected it, as she assumed, but she could still identify the exact spot where it had been from the slight disturbance in the dust along the baseboard. 18 inches from the left curtain edge. She had remembered correctly. She studied the window itself from her chair. It was a sash window, double hung, original to the house she suspected, with the slightly imperfect fit that old windows developed over decades of the house shifting and settling around them. The brass latch was, as she had noted the previous night, firmly in the downward position, locked. But she looked at the curtains. Heavy velvet, a deep burgundy, hanging from brass rings on a rod fixed above the window frame. They had been drawn all evening. She was certain of that, and they were drawn now. She could see, from her angle, that the left curtain hung very slightly differently from the right. The right curtain fell in smooth, undisturbed folds. The left curtain had a faint irregularity near the bottom, barely perceptible, the sort of thing you would not notice if you were not specifically looking, as though something had caught against it, briefly, from the outside. Miss Marple knitted 3 more rows and thought about windows. She also thought about the clock. The grandfather clock stood exactly where it had always stood, in the far corner, ticking with complete composure. In the morning light, it looked even more impressive than it had the previous evening. The mahogany casing was beautifully maintained, the brass fittings polished, the painted face clear and dignified. Miss Marple rose from her armchair, apologised absently to Constable Perkins for disturbing him, and went to look at it. Up close, it was even finer than she had appreciated. The case was perhaps 6 feet tall, with carved detailing at the top. Scrollwork, she thought, though her knowledge of wood-carving terminology was not extensive. The pendulum was visible through a small glass panel in the lower portion of the case, swinging with the steady, self-satisfied rhythm of a mechanism that knew its own reliability. She looked at the face, examined the hands, let her eyes travel down the case to the base, which sat on 4 small brass feet on the drawing-room floor. Then she looked at the side of the case, facing the wall. There was a gap. Not large, perhaps 4 inches between the side of the clock and the panelled wall behind it, but enough for someone with a purpose and a knowledge of what they were doing to reach the mechanism. She tried to see into the gap, and could not, from this angle, see much of anything. She would have liked to move the clock slightly. She did not feel she could do this with Constable Perkins watching. She made a note of the gap's dimensions in her mind and returned to her armchair. It was while she was sitting there, turning the problem of the clock over in her mind, that she made her first mistake. She had been thinking about the chime mechanism, about how precisely one might alter a clock to strike an extra time, and her mind had gone quite naturally to Philip Holt. He was the most technically precise person in the house, the sort of man who arranged his napkin with geometrical accuracy and whose eyes, she had noted, went to the clock with some regularity during the previous evening. And there was the matter of that silent exchange with Gerald during dinner. Something financial, she had assumed. Something to do with the slightly too long handshake on arrival. She had, she realized now, with the slightly uncomfortable sensation of a theory beginning to loosen at the corners, been building a case against Philip Holt in her mind since approximately the soup course, and she had been doing it, if she was honest, partly because he was the most obviously suspicious person in the room, and obvious suspects had a way of occupying one's attention that was not always deserved. Her niece Raymond's husband, a perfectly pleasant young man who wrote modern novels that Miss Marple found somewhat exhausting, had once told her that the most interesting character in any story was never the one you noticed first. She had thanked him politely and thought no more of it at the time. She was thinking of it now. Because Philip Holt, she was becoming increasingly aware, was perhaps exactly what he appeared to be. A solicitor with a long professional relationship with Gerald Ashworth, conducting whatever quiet piece of financial business solicitors conducted, entirely uninvolved with stolen pendants and malfunctioning clocks. She had been looking at him too hard, and when you looked too hard at one thing, you tended to look too softly at everything else. She set her knitting down in her lap and looked at the room again. Fresh eyes. Start again. Who had the most to gain from the pendant's disappearance? The obvious answer was whoever had taken it, which was not, she admitted to herself, particularly helpful. Who had known before last night that the pendant would be on display? Gerald had decided to show it at dinner, but had the decision truly been spontaneous? Or had it been arranged in advance? And if arranged, with whom and when? Who had known the house well enough to know about the clock mechanism? That was a better question. The clock had been in the family since 1901. Someone who knew the house well, who had grown up in it perhaps, or had spent considerable time in it, would know its particular qualities and peculiarities far better than a weekend guest. Miss Marple thought about Thomas Ashworth's blank, careful face in the lamplight. She thought about Elsie Pratt, pausing in the corridor outside the dining room. She thought about a single curved fragment of glass on a clean floor. And she thought about the curtain that hung differently on the left side than on the right. She picked up her knitting again. The clock ticked on. At 11:30, Inspector Graves came back into the drawing room and found Miss Marple still knitting in the armchair by the window. He looked at her with the expression of a man who was not entirely sure how she had got there, but had decided it was not worth the energy of removing her. "Making progress?" Miss Marple asked pleasantly. "Early stages," he said, in the tone of someone who was not going to say anything more than that. "Of course." She paused. "Inspector, the window. Have you had it examined? The latch? Specifically." He looked at her. "The window is locked, Miss Marple. I examined it myself this morning." "Yes," she said, "latched from the inside." "Quite so." Another pause. "It's just, and I may be entirely wrong about this, I often am, old sash windows sometimes develop a rather interesting characteristic when the wood has expanded and contracted over many years. The latch can appear to be in the locked position while actually sitting just fractionally short of the full catch, enough to hold under normal circumstances, but not perhaps under pressure from outside." Inspector Graves was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'll have Perkins take another look." "I'm sure it's nothing," said Miss Marple. "Just a thought." She returned to her knitting, and the clock ticked. And outside, the pale November sun continued its unconvincing efforts at the window, and Thornfield Manor held its breath and waited. Shadows and suspicions. Lunch at Thornfield Manor that day was a subdued affair. The morning's interviews had left everyone slightly hollowed out in the way that official questioning tended to do. Not because any of them had, presumably, said anything particularly damaging, but because being asked direct questions by a policeman had a way of making ordinary people feel retrospectively guilty about things they had not done, which was uncomfortable and not especially conducive to appetite. The soup was cream of mushroom. It was very good. Miss Marple had 2 helpings, which earned her a look of mild surprise from Mrs. Bantry, and a look of something rather more complicated from Thomas Ashworth, who had eaten almost nothing, and was sitting at the table with the rigid stillness of a man engaged in a private argument with himself. Sir Gerald Ashworth, by contrast, was eating with determined normality, cutting his bread, drinking his water, responding to conversational attempts with the automatic social fluency of a man who had been performing composure for so long, it had become indistinguishable from the real thing. Only his eyes gave him away, and only if you were watching them. They moved, constantly, carefully, from face to face around the table, checking and rechecking with the systematic anxiety of a man counting something he was afraid to find missing. Philip Holt ate neatly and said very little. Vivian Castle talked rather a lot, which Miss Marple suspected was her natural response to any form of tension, and the subjects she chose: a mutual friend's recent divorce, a West End play she had seen in October, the particular merits of the Ashworth's cook, had the slightly feverish quality of someone throwing conversational topics into a silence they were determined not to let develop. Dorothea Ashworth said almost nothing at all. She sat at her end of the table and was present in the way that a piece of furniture is present, occupying space, performing function, revealing nothing. But once, when Gerald said something to Philip Holt in a lowered voice that Miss Marple could not quite catch, Dorothea's hand tightened on her water glass with a brief involuntary force that left her knuckles white for a moment before she consciously relaxed them. Miss Marple noticed. She always noticed hands. After lunch, the guests dispersed in the vague, some purposeless manner of people who were not quite sure what the appropriate activity was for an afternoon following a theft and a gunshot in a house where the police had asked them all, politely but firmly, to remain on the premises. Colonel Bantry retreated to the library with the improving book he was not reading. Mrs. Bantry wrote letters at the writing desk in the morning room with the efficient industry of a woman who felt better when she was doing something useful. Philip Holt walked in the garden, which struck Miss Marple as a slightly chilly choice for a November afternoon, but not an incriminating one. Vivienne Castle went upstairs to lie down, she said. Thomas Ashworth disappeared entirely for the better part of an hour, which was interesting. Miss Marple sat in the morning room with Mrs. Bantry and her knitting, and thought, she had 3 suspects in her mind, arranged in a rough order that she acknowledged to herself was probably wrong in at least one respect. Thomas Ashworth was at the top, for reasons that she found both compelling and slightly uncomfortable. He had grown up in this house. He knew the clock. He had asked about the pendant's location at dinner. with a casualness that had not quite convinced her then, and convinced her even less now. His face in the lamplight had been too carefully blank. And there was something between him and his father, some tension or grievance that had the particular quality of a long-standing wound rather than a recent one, financial, perhaps, or something to do with inheritance. She had seen that particular flavour of father and son difficulty before, in St. Mary Mead and elsewhere, and it rarely improved with time. But she was aware, and she made herself be aware, deliberately, after her error of the previous morning regarding Philip Holt, that she might be constructing a narrative around Thomas because he was young and troubled, and therefore fitted a certain pattern she recognised. Patterns were useful. They were also dangerous when you let them do too much of the work. Elsie Pratt occupied a smaller but persistent space in her thinking. The maid's pauses in the corridor, the particular alertness of a young woman who was listening to things that were not her business, or possibly to things that were very much her business indeed. Domestic staff knew houses in ways that guests never did, knew the sounds and the schedules and the small mechanical peculiarities of old buildings, knew, for instance, which windows did not catch quite properly in the cold. And then there was the question of the accomplice, because Miss Marple was increasingly certain that there had been one. The 13th chime as a signal. And she was now quite settled on this, though she could not yet entirely prove it. Implied communication, implied coordination, implied that whoever had struck the chime inside the house had been communicating with someone outside it, or at least in a different part of it. You did not design a signal if there was no one to receive it, which meant at minimum 2 people. She knitted a careful row and considered combinations. Thomas and an outside accomplice, possible. Thomas and Elsie, also possible. And the thought of it gave her an uncomfortable small feeling that she recognized as sympathy getting slightly ahead of evidence, which was something she tried to be careful about. Someone else entirely, using Thomas and Elsie as unwitting elements of a scene designed to look a certain way. That third possibility, she thought, deserved more attention than she had given it. It was at 2:30 that she had the conversation with Vivian Castle that changed the shape of things considerably. She had not been seeking it. She had gone upstairs to fetch a second ball of wool, the pale blue one. She was making a cardigan for her great-niece, and she had encountered Vivian in the upper corridor, not lying down at all, standing outside the door of the room that Miss Marple was fairly certain belonged to Gerald and Dorothea Ashworth. Vivian turned when she heard Miss Marple's step. That and her expression went through 3 things very quickly before settling on the 4th. The first thing was surprise. The second was guilt. The third was calculation. The 4th was warmth. "Miss Marple, I thought I heard something from Dorothea's room. Wanted to check she was all right." "How thoughtful," said Miss Marple. A brief pause. Vivian's smile remained in place with the determined stability of something that had been put there on purpose. "Are you finding it terribly awful?" Vivian said, falling into step beside Miss Marple as she continued down the corridor. "All this police business. I must say I find Inspector Graves rather oppressive. That way he has of looking at you, as though he's already decided something and is simply waiting for you to confirm it." "I thought he seemed quite fair," Miss Marple said mildly. "Oh, I'm sure he is, professionally." Vivian waved a hand. "It's just, one feels so terribly scrutinized, even when one has absolutely nothing to hide, which of course," a laugh, "which of course none of us do." Miss Marple smiled and said nothing. They reached the top of the stairs. Vivian paused with her hand on the banister and looked at Miss Marple with an expression that had dropped several of its layers. "You knew something was wrong last night," she said. "Before the clock, before all of it. I watched you at dinner. You were looking at everyone, really looking, not the way people look when they're just being polite." A pause. "What did you see?" Miss Marple considered this honestly. "I'm not sure yet," she said. "I saw a great many things, some of which I suspect are important and some of which are probably not. The difficulty is knowing which is which." Vivian looked at her for a long moment. Something genuine moved across her face. Not the theatrical warmth, not the calculated charm, but something underneath those things, quieter and less comfortable. "The pendant," she said. "Gerald told me some weeks ago that he was intending to sell it, quietly, without telling Dorothea." A pause. "I don't know if that's relevant." "Everything is potentially relevant," Miss Marple said gently. "Thank you for telling me." Vivian nodded once and went downstairs. Miss Marple stood at the top of the staircase for a moment, holding her ball of pale blue wool, and felt the shape of the case shift and rearrange itself around this new piece of information, like a kaleidoscope given a single turn. Gerald had been planning to sell the pendant, without telling Dorothea, which meant, possibly, that the pendant's disappearance was not entirely unwelcome to Gerald, which meant, possibly, that Gerald Ashworth was not quite the victim he appeared to be, which meant that the careful, composed performance at the lunch table might have been something other than a man dealing with loss. Miss Marple descended the stairs slowly, her hand on the rail, thinking very hard. She was beginning to see the outline of it, just the outline, blurred at the edges, several pieces still missing. But it was there, and it had a shape, and the shape was becoming familiar in the way that shapes did when you had been looking at them long enough from the right angle. The clock, the chime, the glass, the window, the pendant. And now, Gerald, and a quiet plan to sell, and a wife who was not supposed to know. She needed to look at the clock again, properly this time, without Constable Perkins and his notebook between her and the mechanism. She needed to see what was on the other side of that 4-inch gap between the case and the wall. And she needed to speak to Elsie Pratt, the mechanism of deception. Elsie Pratt was not easy to find. This was itself interesting. Domestic staff in large houses were generally either very visible, moving through rooms with trays and dusters, and the purposeful invisibility of people whose job required them to be present without being noticed, or they were in the kitchen and the service areas, which were their own domain, and which guests did not generally penetrate without a reason. Elsie seemed to be neither. Miss Marple had looked in the drawing room, the morning room, and the upstairs landing, and had found in each place evidence of recent tidying, but no Elsie. She finally located her in the small linen cupboard at the end of the east corridor, not tidying the linen, but sitting on the lower shelf with her knees drawn up and her apron twisted in her hands, staring at the opposite wall with the fixed expression of someone engaged in very concentrated worrying. She startled badly when Miss Marple opened the door. "I'm so sorry," Miss Marple said, with complete sincerity. "I didn't mean to frighten you. I was looking for an extra pillowcase, actually. The one on my bed has developed a small tear, and I didn't want to bother Mrs. Henley with it." This was not true, but it had the merit of being entirely believable. "Are you all right, my dear?" Elsie scrambled to her feet. She was perhaps 19, Miss Marple thought, a fresh-faced girl with dark eyes that were currently somewhat red at the edges, and a chin that was set with the determined firmness of someone who had been crying and was not going to do so again if she could possibly help it. "Yes, ma'am. Sorry, ma'am. I was just—" She stopped. Taking a moment, Miss Marple supplied gently. "Yes." A pause. "Yes, that's right." Miss Marple took a pillowcase from the shelf. She would return it later with the tear story intact, and then said, quite casually, in the tone of someone making conversation rather than asking a question, "It's been a very upsetting night for everyone in the house. I imagine it's been particularly difficult for the staff. You were here, of course, when all of it happened, unlike the guests, who arrived only yesterday." Elsie said nothing, but her hands, Miss Marple noticed, had gone quite still on her apron, which was a different kind of response from the twisting they had been doing before. "The police have been very thorough," Miss Marple continued pleasantly. "Inspector Graves seems a competent man. I expect he'll want to speak with all the staff again before long. A small pause. Sometimes people remember things the second time that they didn't mention the first time. Not because they were hiding them, necessarily. Just because they didn't realize they were important. Elsie looked at her. The red-edged eyes were sharp underneath their distress, sharper than Miss Marple had initially given them credit for. I don't know anything about the pendant, Elsie said. I told the inspector that. I'm sure you did, said Miss Marple. I wasn't thinking about the pendant, actually. I was thinking about the clock. The stillness that came over Elsie Pratt at that word was the most informative thing that had happened to Miss Marple since she had found the fragment of glass on the drawing-room floor. She did not push, she had learned. Over many years of conversations that mattered, that pushing was almost always counterproductive. It made people defensive, and defensive people became either silent or dishonest, neither of which was useful. Instead, she said gently that she was sure everything would become clear in time, and that young people who found themselves in difficult situations through no particular fault of their own were generally much better served by honesty than by silence, and that if Elsie ever felt she needed someone to talk to who was not a policeman and not connected to the Ashworth family in any official capacity, she was welcome to knock on the door of the Blue Room. Then she took her pillowcase and left. She gave Elsie 20 minutes. The knock came in 15. What Elsie told her, in the Blue Room with the door closed and a cup of tea that Miss Marple had arranged with the small travelling kettle she always brought on country weekends, was this. 3 weeks ago, a man had come to the tradesman's entrance of Thornfield Manor. Not to deliver anything. He had no packages, no van, no visible purpose. He had asked for Elsie specifically, which had surprised her, and he had known her name and her schedule and the fact that she had a younger brother in Swindon who had recently lost his job at the factory. He had been pleasant. That was the word Elsie kept returning to. Pleasant. Not threatening, not rough. Nicely dressed, she said, in the way of a man who took care of his appearance. He had known things about the house, the layout, the servants' schedule, and the position of the drawing-room clock. That suggested he had either been inside it before or had been told about it in considerable detail by someone who had. What he had asked Elsie to do was very simple. On the night of the Ashworths' house party, he had known about the house party 3 weeks in advance, which Miss Marple stored carefully. Elsie was to access the mechanism of the grandfather clock through the service panel on the back of the casing and make one small adjustment to the count cam. He had shown her exactly how. He had made her practice on a diagram he had brought with him, a neat technical drawing that showed the interior of a long case clock movement with the relevant component clearly indicated. The adjustment would cause the clock to strike once more than it should at midnight. Just once, just the one extra chime. And you did it, Miss Marple said, not accusingly, simply confirming. Elsie's chin came up. He said it was a joke, a prank, for Mr. Gerald's birthday, that it would make the clock strike once extra and everyone would laugh. She paused. I know how that sounds. It sounds like something a frightened young woman with a brother in difficult circumstances might choose to believe, Miss Marple said, with complete gentleness. What did he offer you? £20. She said it with the shame of someone admitting to something small and consequential at once. And he said my brother wouldn't. He said there were people who could help with the factory situation. £20, Miss Marple thought, and a brother in Swindon who needed work. It was not a fortune. It was exactly the right amount, enough to matter very much to a girl of 19 on a maid's wages, not so much as to make her feel she was doing something seriously wrong. The man, whoever he was, had calibrated it carefully. Did he tell you his name? No, I asked and he laughed and said to call him Mr. Smith, which I knew wasn't his real name. She paused. He had a scar, here. She indicated a small area below her left ear. Not large, like an old burn maybe. Miss Marple nodded and did not write this down, because she had not brought anything to write with, which she felt mildly annoyed at herself about. After Elsie had gone, back to her work, steadier than she had arrived. With Miss Marple's firm assurance that telling the inspector what she had just told her would result in considerably less trouble than not telling him, Miss Marple sat in the blue room armchair and assembled what she now knew. The 13th chime had been a signal. She had been right about that from the beginning, or nearly the beginning, which was satisfying in a limited way. The signal had been received, must have been received, by someone outside the drawing room window, someone who, on hearing the 13th chime, had acted. Quickly, quietly, in the 15 to 20 seconds between the last stroke and the gunshot. Or rather, and this was the part she was still working on, in the moments around the gunshot, because the gunshot troubled her, not its existence. She had accommodated the gunshot into her thinking from the moment she heard it. What troubled her was its purpose. A theft conducted with this degree of planning did not require a gunshot. A signal had already been established. The pendant was on display in a room that, at midnight, would be empty of people. Why introduce a gunshot? Why create noise, alarm, investigation? Unless the gunshot was itself a misdirection, unless it was designed not to signal anything, but to unsignal something, to pull attention toward a sound and away from another sound happening at the same time or just after it. She thought about the curved fragment of glass on the drawing room floor. She thought about the window that appeared to be latched but might not catch quite properly in the cold. She thought about the heavy burgundy curtain hanging differently on the left side. A window opened quickly from outside. The sound of glass, not breaking, she thought now, but something subtler. The pendant removed. The window closed again. The latch resettled, or perhaps never fully dislodged in the first place. And the gunshot, sharp, flat, definitive, covering the small sounds of that operation. The quiet scrape of a sash window, the soft displacement of a curtain, the almost nothing sound of a pendant lifted from blue velvet. But what had made the gunshot? She went over the drawing room in her mind, with the careful attention of someone walking through a familiar room in the dark, touching each piece of furniture to confirm its position. The fireplace, the writing desk, the side table with the lamp, the chairs, the bookcases. And the clock. She stopped at the clock, a clock that had already been interfered with, a clock whose mechanism had been accessed through the service panel at the back of the casing, a clock standing 4 inches from the wall, enough space for a hand or a device, or, she sat forward in her chair, a clock with a chime mechanism that had been deliberately modified. What if it had been modified for more than one purpose? She was on her feet before she had fully completed the thought, moving with a speed that her knees registered mild protest about, and she was out of the blue room and down the corridor and down the stairs before she had consciously decided to do any of these things. The drawing room was empty. Constable Perkins had apparently been reassigned to something else, which suited Miss Marple very well. She crossed the room directly, without preliminary, went to the grandfather clock and looked at the gap between the case and the wall. 4 inches. She had remembered correctly. She reached into her cardigan pocket for the small torch she carried, another habit from many years of country weekends in old houses with inadequate lighting, and directed its beam into the gap. For a moment she could not see anything useful. The side of the clock casing, the wall panel behind it, the thin strip of skirting board at the base. Then she moved the beam downward toward the floor and saw it. A small metal bracket fixed to the baseboard behind the clock. Recently fixed, the screws were bright, not tarnished, and the wood around them was pale where the surface had been disturbed. The bracket itself was perhaps 2 inches wide, and it was empty now. But it had clearly held something. There were faint pressure marks on its inner surface, the kind left by an object that has been clamped firmly in place and then removed. Something had been attached to the baseboard behind the clock, something that had been there during the party and was not there now. Miss Marple straightened up slowly, with the careful attention to her back that the years had made necessary, and stood for a moment looking at the clock. A modified chime mechanism, a bracket behind the casing, a gunshot with no visible source, a window that opened from outside and closed again. A pendant lifted in the space of seconds. It was, she thought, really quite clever. Not clever in the showy, complicated way of someone who had read too many detective novels and fallen in love with their own ingenuity. Clever in the practical, a mechanical way of someone who understood how things worked, clocks and windows and human attention, and had used that understanding with patience and precision. She knew, now, most of it, the mechanism, the method, the how. What remained was the who. And standing in the drawing room with her small torch and the ticking of the clock and the pale November light at the window, she thought she knew that too. She thought she had known it, if she was entirely honest, since lunch. She simply had not been ready to know it yet. The clock confesses. She found Inspector Graves in the small sitting room off the entrance hall, where he had established what amounted to a temporary office, papers arranged on the side table, a cold cup of tea at his elbow, Constable Perkins in the corner with his notebook at the ready. Graves looked up when Miss Marple came in, and his expression suggested he had been expecting her, or someone like her, for some time. "Miss Marple," he said. "Inspector." She sat down in the chair across from him without being invited, which she felt the circumstances warranted. "I think it might be useful if we compared notes." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Perkins, would you give us a few minutes?" Perkins looked faintly surprised, but gathered his notebook and went. She told him everything in the order that she had learned it, which was not quite the order in which it had happened, but was the order that made most sense for someone coming to it fresh. She told him about the fragment of glass and the curtain and the window latch. She told him about Elsie Pratt and the man with the scar below his left ear and the £20 and the technical diagram of a long case clock movement. She told him about the bracket behind the clock casing. She described its position precisely, because precision was what inspectors needed and vagueness was what wasted their time. And she told him about Vivian Castle and the pendant and Gerald's quiet intention to sell it without telling his wife. Graves listened to all of it without interrupting, which she appreciated. He was a good listener, as she thought, the kind who was actually processing what he heard rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, his fingers resting flat on the table. "The bracket," he said. "You're certain it was recently placed?" The screws were bright, unoxidized, and the wood around them was pale, raw almost. It had not been there long. "And your interpretation of its function?" Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "A small device, mechanical or spring-loaded, I would think. I'm afraid my knowledge of such things is limited to the theoretical. Fixed to the baseboard behind the clock, positioned so that the clock's own vibration at the moment of striking could trigger it, or timed separately, a clockwork mechanism of its own, set to activate at a specific hour." She paused. "Something that would produce a sharp, percussive sound, loud enough to carry through the floor above, brief enough to be mistaken for a gunshot by people who heard it from a distance through walls and floorboards and had already been startled by an anomalous clock." Graves was quiet. "No one fired a gun last night," Miss Marple said. "I am fairly certain of that. What we heard was a device designed to sound like a gunshot, designed to bring everyone out of their rooms, into the corridor, down the stairs, to create movement and noise and the particular confusion of people who have been woken suddenly and are not thinking at their clearest. While that confusion was happening, the drawing room window was opened from outside. The pendant was taken. The window was closed again. The whole operation, I suspect, it took no more than 30 seconds. And the 13th chime was the signal to the person outside, telling them the device had activated, that the household was in motion. Or rather, Miss Marple said, telling them the household would be in motion within moments. The person outside would need a few seconds of warning, time to position themselves at the window to be ready. The chime provided that. 13 strokes rather than 12 gave them precisely enough time. Graves picked up his pen. Put it down again. It's an extraordinary amount of planning. Yes, she agreed. It is, which tells us something about the person who planned it. There was a pause. Outside the window, the November afternoon was fading early, the light going grey and flat across the front lawn. Somewhere in the house, a door closed. Footsteps crossed the floor above them, the measured, deliberate footsteps of someone pacing. "You have someone in mind," Graves said. It was not a question. "I have had several people in mind," Miss Marple said honestly. "I was wrong about one of them, which I find instructive. I was too quick to focus on Mr. Holt because he was precisely and neatly suspicious, and precise, neat suspicion is usually worth examining carefully." She paused. "Thomas Ashworth has been in my thinking since the first evening. The son? He grew up in this house. He knows the clock, has known it since childhood. He would know about the service panel at the back of the casing, which is not something a casual visitor would think to look for. He would know the window, its particular imperfection, the way the latch sits." She hesitated. "He also has a motive that is not simply financial, though I suspect it is partly that. There is something between him and his father that has been wrong for some time, not a sudden grievance, an old one." Graves nodded slowly. "We found something this morning," he said after a moment, "in Thomas Ashworth's room. A receipt, a repair invoice dated 6 weeks ago from a clockmaker in Cirencester. The invoice describes work done on a long-case clock movement, adjustment to the count cam and the strike train." Miss Marple was quiet for a moment. "He had it done professionally? And then, presumably, reversed the work himself on the night? Or had Elsie reverse it, with the adjustment she was instructed to make?" He paused. "The clockmaker in Cirencester, a Mr. Fielding, has been contacted. He remembers the commission. Says the young man who brought in the movement component was well-spoken, knew what he wanted, paid in cash." "Of course," said Miss Marple. "Cash throughout, I would imagine, except for the receipt, which was careless." She paused. "Or perhaps not careless, perhaps kept deliberately." Graves looked at her. "Why would he keep a receipt that incriminates him?" "I don't know yet," she admitted. "But I find I am more interested in things that don't quite fit than in things that do. The receipt doesn't fit. A man who planned this operation with such thoroughness does not accidentally keep incriminating paperwork." She looked at her hands. "Unless he wanted, on some level, to be caught, or unless the receipt was meant to be found, and is itself a misdirection." A pause. "I may be wrong about that. I frequently am about the final layer of things." They brought Thomas Ashworth into the sitting room at 4 o'clock. Miss Marple had asked and Graves had agreed, with the slightly pained expression of a man departing from standard procedure, but unable to construct a satisfying objection, that she might remain in the corner of the room during the interview. She sat with her knitting, and was, she hoped, sufficiently unobtrusive. Thomas came in with the set face and squared shoulders of someone who had been preparing for this moment, and was determined to meet it on his own terms. He sat down across from Inspector Graves, and looked at him with steady grey eyes that were, Miss Marple noticed, his mother's eyes entirely. "Mr. Ashworth," Graves began, "I'd like to talk about the grandfather clock." Something moved across Thomas's face. Huss not surprise. He had been expecting this, clearly. Something more like relief, which Miss Marple found very interesting indeed. "All right," Thomas said. "We have a receipt. Cirencester. A Mr. Fielding." A pause. "Yes." "You had the count cam adjusted to produce an additional strike." "Yes." Graves leaned forward slightly. "Why?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment. His hands were resting on his knees, very still. His mother's habit, Miss Marple thought, the deliberate stillness. And he was looking at a point slightly to the left of Inspector Graves's shoulder, as though he were reading something written on the wall behind him. "My father," he said at last, "has been embezzling from the family trust for 4 years." The room was very quiet. The pendant was part of the trust assets. It was not his to sell, or which is what he intended to do. Philip Holt, who is his solicitor, yes, but also happens to be the most spineless man of my acquaintance, had arranged a private buyer. The sale was to happen within the month. My mother would have lost not only the pendant but the legal right to contest it once the transaction was complete. He paused. I couldn't prove the embezzlement. Not yet. Not without access to documents that Holt controls. But I could take the pendant, remove it from the equation, give my mother time. By staging a theft, Graves said. By removing the pendant from the house before my father could sell it quietly to a man in Geneva. His jaw tightened. I was going to return it, to my mother, once I had the documents I needed. And the accomplice outside the window? For the first time, Thomas hesitated. A friend. I would rather not. He had no knowledge of the full situation. He was told he was helping me retrieve something of mine, which was not entirely untrue. We'll need his name. Yes, I know. Another pause. I know. Miss Marple set down her knitting. She had not intended to speak. This was, strictly, Inspector Graves's interview, and she was there on sufferance and was well aware of it. But Thomas Ashworth had looked up from the wall behind Graves's shoulder and was now looking directly at her, with an expression that was too complicated to name. Not quite an appeal, not quite a challenge. Something that acknowledged, simply, that she had been watching all along, and that he had known it. The receipt, she said. You kept it deliberately. He looked at her for a moment, then, quietly. I kept it for my mother. If anything went wrong, if I was caught before I could explain, she would need to understand why. What I had found, what I had been trying to do. A pause. She's known for 2 years that something was wrong with the finances. She didn't know how wrong. Miss Marple nodded once and picked up her knitting again. She thought of Dorothea Ashworth at the dinner table, straight-backed and composed, touching her pearl necklace. Thought of grey, tired eyes that were sharper than they appeared. Thought of a woman who had known something was wrong and had not known how wrong, and had spent 2 years carrying that particular weight with the quiet endurance of someone who had no better option. She thought of Thomas at 26, in a house that was not quite right and had not been for some time, trying to fix something that adults had broken. She was not, she reminded herself, here to make moral judgments. She was here to understand what had happened and to be useful to the process of understanding it. The moral judgments were Graves's business, and the law's business, and ultimately the business of the people involved, who would have to live with the consequences regardless of what she thought about them. But she was human, for all that, and she thought what she thought. The strike train ready to perform its correct and honest function at the next hour. It looked entirely innocent. It looked exactly as it had always looked. Clocks, Miss Marple reflected, were rather good at that. She thought about Elsie Pratt, who would need someone to speak for her when this came fully to light. A young woman who had made a poor decision under pressure, which was a very human thing to do, and who deserved to have that context clearly presented. She intended to speak to Inspector Graves about it before she left. She thought about Philip Holt, who was a spineless man, but not, she suspected, a criminal one, a solicitor who had been compliant rather than actively dishonest, which was a distinction the law would take some interest in drawing. She did not feel very sorry for him. She thought about Vivian Castle, who had told her about Gerald's plan to sell the pendant, and wondered at what point Vivian had known that the information would be useful, and to whom, and why she had chosen Miss Marple as its recipient. She had a feeling Vivian was rather more clear-eyed about the Ashworth family situation than she had ever let on, and had been waiting for an appropriate moment to deploy what she knew. One could not entirely disapprove of that, even if the methods were slightly theatrical. And she thought about Dorothea. When Graves was finished with Gerald, she would ask to see Dorothea. There were things Dorothea needed to know and things she would need to decide, and she would need someone in her corner when she decided them. Miss Marple did not know whether she was the right person for that role. She was, after all, a thorough guest who had arrived only yesterday and would be gone by Sunday, but she thought she was perhaps a more useful person for it than anyone else currently available. She would do what she could. She generally did. The clock struck the half-hour, once correctly, clearly, with the solid authority of a mechanism restored to its proper function. Miss Marple approved. The last cup of tea. She left Thornfield Manor on Sunday morning. The sky was the particular pale grey of an English November that had decided to be neither dramatic nor pleasant, simply present in the mild, persistent way of weather that had nowhere better to be. Colonel Bantry loaded the bags into the rover with cheerful efficiency, and Mrs. Bantry said goodbye to Dorothea Ashworth on the front steps for rather a long time, in the warm and slightly fierce manner of a woman communicating several important things through the medium of a farewell embrace. Miss Marple waited by the car and looked back at the house. Thornfield Manor looked exactly as it had when they had arrived 2 days ago. The iron gates, the freshly raked gravel, the east window on the upper floor. The curtain in that window was still now. Whatever it had been doing on Friday afternoon, it had apparently resolved itself. Or perhaps she had simply been looking at it differently then. Gerald Ashworth had not come to see them off. This had been handled with perfect smoothness by the information that he was resting, a fiction that everyone present accepted with the mutual courtesy of people who understood that some situations required the temporary suspension of honesty in the interests of ordinary life continuing to function. Thomas had come down. He had shaken Colonel Bantry's hand and kissed Mrs. Bantry's cheek, and then turned to Miss Marple with an expression that was, she thought, the most unguarded she had seen on his face since his arrival. "I don't quite know what to say," he said. "Then don't say anything," she told him pleasantly. "Just make sure your mother has good legal advice. Not Mr. Holt." A ghost of a smile. "No, not Mr. Holt. And Thomas." She looked at him directly, in the way she sometimes did when she wanted to be certain something was heard properly. "What you did was not without considerable risk to yourself. That matters. Whatever else is decided about the legality of it, and I imagine various people will have various opinions on that subject, the reason you did it matters." He looked at her for a moment. Something in his face settled, not resolved, not finished, but settled in the way that things settle when they have been acknowledged by someone whose acknowledgement means something. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For all of it." She nodded once and got into the rover. They were 20 minutes down the road. I passed Welling Cross and onto the main road south, when Mrs. Bantry said, "Well?" "Yes," agreed Colonel Bantry from the front. "I thought it was Philip Holt," Mrs. Bantry confided to Miss Marple, "from the very first evening. Something about the way he arranged his napkin." "Napkin arrangement," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "is rarely conclusive." "No, I suppose not." A pause. "Did you know it was Thomas, from the beginning?" Miss Marple considered this honestly. "I suspected Thomas from quite early on, but I was wrong about several things along the way, which was useful, in the end. Being wrong about Philip Holt made me look at everyone else more carefully." She paused. "I find that being wrong is often more instructive than being right, if one is paying attention." Mrs. Bantry considered this. "I'm not sure I find it instructive so much as irritating." "That too," Miss Marple agreed. They stopped at a small tea room in Welling Cross, because Colonel Bantry said he needed petrol, and Mrs. Bantry said she needed tea, and Miss Marple needed neither, but welcomed both. The tea room was warm and smelled of baking, and had lace curtains and a small coal fire, and the woman behind the counter knew Mrs. Bantry by name and brought them a plate of scones without being asked. Miss Marple sat with her tea and looked out of the lace-curtained window at the grey November street and thought about clocks, about the way the 13th chime had moved through the floorboards of the old house and up through the walls of the blue room and reached her in the particular darkness of almost midnight. about the way it had struck her, that one extra note, that small aberration in the established order of things, as wrong in the very specific way that only something carefully designed to be wrong could be. She had been asked once by Raymond's wife, a perfectly sensible young woman who wrote poetry that Miss Marple found slightly exhausting, but respected nonetheless, how she did it, how she looked at a room full of people and found the thing that mattered. She had not had a very satisfying answer at the time. She still did not, entirely. It was something to do with paying attention, and something to do with having lived long enough to recognize patterns, and something to do with the villages of England where she had spent most of her life, where people were, underneath the particular local details, recognizably and consistently themselves, and where the things they did out of love or fear or greed or desperation were the same things people had always done and would always do. Thomas Ashworth had done something for his mother. He had done it imperfectly, with methods that the law would have to take a view on, using a young maid's vulnerability and a clockmaker's expertise and a friend's loyalty, and it had not gone quite according to plan. It had gone considerably more public than he had intended, and he was sitting in Thornfield Manor now with consequences he would have to manage. But he had done it for his mother, and his mother had known, in those grey, tired, sharp eyes, that something was wrong, and had waited and carried it and not broken under it. People, Miss Marple thought, were very often both better and worse than they appeared. The difficulty was knowing which part to attend to. She finished her tea. The scone was excellent. "Ready?" said Colonel Bantry, appearing in the doorway with the benign impatience of a man whose petrol tank was full. "Quite ready," said Miss Marple, and gathered her bag and her knitting and her coat, and went back out into the grey November morning, and left Thornfield Manor and its secrets to whatever came next. Outro. And so the clock fell silent, not in defeat, but in confession, because that is what clocks do in the end if you listen carefully enough. They do not lie. They simply mark the time in which lies are told, and wait, with the patience of brass and mahogany, for someone to notice the extra chime. Miss Marple noticed. She always does. The clock that struck 13 is a story about the sounds we hear and the sounds we choose to ignore, about the mechanisms we build, in clocks, in houses, in families, to keep certain truths from striking at the wrong hour, and about a quiet elderly lady with a knitting bag and a great deal of accumulated experience who understands, better than most, that the most important clues are never the loudest ones. They are the ones that arrive one beat too late, or one beat too many. If this story found its way into a quiet corner of your evening, a chair by the fire perhaps, or a cold night with a warm blanket, then it has done exactly what it was meant to do. These are the kinds of stories worth telling. Old houses and older secrets, the particular atmosphere of an English November, the satisfaction of a mystery that resolves not with violence, but with understanding. If you enjoyed The Clock That Struck 13, do share it with someone who appreciates a well-kept secret and a well-timed revelation. And if you have thoughts about Miss Marple, about Thornfield Manor, about the moment the clock struck one time too many, they are always welcome. Until the next story, listen carefully